In this video, we will see in detail some of the ideas we briefly mentioned in previous videos, such as, what is it that we call base table in a web panel? Does every web panel have a base table? What is the difference between a web panel's base table and a grid's base table? And finally, why is all this important to us? Let's start from the beginning. The web panel below has no need whatsoever to access the database because it only requests one piece of data from the user through this variable declared here. And with this data, it calls another object. This web panel will therefore not have a base table. Instead, this web panel, which is called by the other web panel, is showing data of customer 2 of the database. On the form, we can see the attributes that appear, which are interpreted by GeneXus as an implied request to go to the database and retrieve the corresponding information. In runtime, it shows customer 2, because if we check this web panel's rules, we will see that it receives it as parameter in the identifier attribute customer ID, so it will automatically filter by it. We can see how then this view customer info web panel does have a base table, that is, a table of the database that is implied in the way we design or program this web panel. We can immediately see the difference between one web panel and the other by taking a look at the navigation lists and seeing what happens with the access to the database. So while in the first web panel, no access to the database is produced whatsoever, this does happen in the second one with the navigation that appears for the load in the form. We can see that the base table is customer and that the filter will be done by the received parameter customer ID. So we've established the difference is in the access to the database. However, this access is not what makes a web panel have a base table or not. What defines this is the fact that this access be implicit. To make this clearer, in the last web panel, we could have programmed the customer loading manually by using variables in the form. Also receiving the parameter in variable, and loading the form variables. From a variable of the business component type customer, this variable is loaded with the customer received in the parameter. End to end, we invoke this new web panel from the Select Customer web panel. We now press F5. Then we select the Select Customer web panel and enter value 2. And we will see that it shows the same information that showed the previous web panel programmed with attributes. However, if we take a look at its navigation list, we will see that no access to the database is indicated, even when this happens in the loading of the business component. In other words, this web panel does not have a base table, though it does access a table. This access was programmed explicitly, not in the implicit way with attributes that the web panel offers to save us time and work. Now we should ask this question. Where in the web panel can we find attributes that implicitly determine a base table of the web panel? First of all, in the form, both outside and inside a grid. In this last case, the customer full name attribute is appearing in a grid. Having a grid with attributes is having an implied for each, to which the order, the conditions, and the code declared in the load event are all applied to finally show the data on screen. Thus, the navigation list informs us that this web panel has a base table, customer. This will make the load event to be executed for each customer in that table. Since the load has a for each, we must navigate its base table, which is indicating that it will be the one with flight seats, enabling us to retrieve the records that correspond to that customer, which will be loaded on the grid exactly at that point in time. In other words, the for each of the load event is nested in the implied one. At runtime, we will see it like this. So, which attributes did GeneXus consider to determine that the web panel's base table, meaning the implied for each, is in fact customer? Those in the fixed part of the form, that is, outside the grid, which in this case we have none. The grid's own, including any hidden ones. The ones of properties order and conditions, also data selector. The ones inside the load event, outside a for each block, in our case we have none, since the ones in the for each will define the for each's own base table and not the base table of the parent in which it's nested. And those in any other event, also outside a for each. In sum, the attributes that GeneXus considers to determine the web panel's base table are the ones in the form, both in the fixed part and in the grid. The ones of properties order, conditions, and data selector in the grid. The ones in events outside the for each blocks. All these attributes are used to determine the base table, just as it's done to determine the base table in the case of a for each. This is why GeneXus determined the customer base table for our View Customer web panel. And what happens in the case of more than one grid in the form? We already saw an example in another video. Here we stop talking about the web panel base table to talk about the base table of each grid. In the example, we have attributes in both grids, in columns, visible or hidden, in any of its order, conditions, and data selector properties, and also in its load events, outside all for each blocks. Here, the programming included only the load of the first grid, and there are no attributes outside the for each. Remember that, when a second grid is added, we can no longer use the generic load event because it would not be possible for us to determine the grid to which it belongs. Therefore, the base table for each grid is determined by considering these attributes exclusively. So for the first grid, and since it uses as hidden column customer ID and the formula attribute customer full name, the customer table will be its base table. For the second grid, with these attributes being attribute flight arrival country name, an inferred subtype, and flight final price, a formula at the flight table level, its base table will be flight seat. As opposed to the case of a web panel with a single grid, the attributes outside for each blocks in any event other than load will not be a factor in determining base tables. However, they must belong to the extended base table of one of the grids. If not, GeneXus will show this in the navigation list. In the case of attributes in the fixed part, the base table of the first grid in the form is determined by considering the loose attributes and not considering the other grids. To learn more about this particular case, visit our wiki.